So good morning. I appreciated your introduction, Nina, and your call to worship, and the idea that the Martyrs' Mirror is not something as familiar to everyone. The Anabaptist martyrs were an unusual group. Many other groups did not have the same belief about adult baptism and were not persecuted. So the Anabaptists were a fairly small group that had a longer line. I remember talking with Larry Tangman when he was here, and he was of Lutheran background. And I always thought, I wonder why he wouldn't consider joining our church. Well, he since moved away, so no longer a question. But so he, as a Lutheran church, Luther posted the 95 Theses to the door in Europe, door of the cathedral. So I always joked with Larry. I thought, Larry, what if we just gave you 20? All right, you can post 20 to our door. Would you join our church then? Well, never quite worked. One special feature of attending a Mennonite college or university that I took full advantage of was interacting with national and international leaders in the Mennonite church. That was not a big deal to many students, and that's fine, but it was significant to me and something I have always appreciated. I think because my mother helped me to know who some of the key leaders were and helped me to recognize these unique opportunities. One couple that came to Bethel College to teach a course was Delton and Marion Franz. Delton was the director of the MCC Washington office at that time in Washington, DC. And so he worked on informing the Mennonite church about policy matters and those kinds of things. His wife, Marion Franz, was the director of the National Peace Tax Fund, and so helped people understand the importance of withholding the portion of your taxes that go to war and the potential consequences of doing that. And so they came to Bethel College while I was a student and taught a course called Church as a Change Agent. Class met for 3 hours in the basement, one time a week, basement classroom of the administration building. And I found it to be an inspiring opportunity to learn from these pillars of the Mennonite church and really of the broader theological community, helping to bear witness to what they felt their faith called them to in their lives. The final exam in that course was the only time I'd ever had an exam like this, and perhaps one of the most unusual. The course involved a lot of book reading and then discussion times. And the final exam was a collection of several quotes. And the only thing you had to do was identify which book that quote came from. So you had to understand what the book was about, the theme, kind of how the person was writing. And you also had to read the books, which may have been part of the point of this exercise. And so the final exam involved recognizing those passages. I don't even remember how well I did. I had read the book and I found the class very stimulating. Well, so I'd like to try that exercise with a few quotes this morning. They're not quotes from those books, of course, but they reflect recent events that I think have a distinct meaning for those of us who claim an Anabaptist heritage, not by bloodlines, but by theology and commitment. I'll say more about that later and tie it into the Martyrs' Mirror that I featured in the children's story. I have two short paragraphs of only 2 or 3 sentences each. As I read them, I'd like you to think about 2 things. First, can you guess what the passage is from? You may be able to. I'll ask whether you have an idea and ask you to raise your hand, but I'm not going to call on anyone, so don't be afraid to just raise your hand and be assertive, even though I'm not going to say, all right, Mill, who do you think it is? But second, think about what your gut reaction is to the passage. How does each of these 2 passages make you feel? Here's the first passage. The clause protects not only the right to harbor religious beliefs inwardly and secretly, it does perhaps its most important work by protecting the ability of those who hold religious beliefs of all kinds to live out their faiths in daily life through the performance or abstention from physical acts. That's the end of the quote. Anyone guess where that passage might be from? One in the back, Tyler, okay. And I don't want to ask you, but just think about what your gut reaction is. That make you feel, yeah, that's what we should be able to do, or yeah, I kind of am not sure about that. Here's the second passage. The state pays tuition for certain students at private schools, so long as the schools are not religious. That is discrimination against religion. A state's anti-establishment interest does not justify enactments that exclude some members of the community from an otherwise generally available public benefit because of their religious exercise. That's the end of the quote. Any ideas where that might come from? Okay, got a couple now. Think about your gut reaction to that quote as I read it. So these quotes may have brought to mind recent decisions from the United States Supreme Court that discuss religion. The first is a quote from Justice Gorsuch, writing for the majority, in a case involving a high school football coach praying in the middle of the field after the football game. The second is a quote from Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, in a case involving state support for private education when the education is sponsored by a religious group. My guess is that most Christians in the United States would applaud these short quotes and the majority decisions they come from. They allow more free religious expression and prevent discrimination against religion. I think most Christians would agree that those seem like important values. And so I'm curious what your gut reaction was. Thinking in the context of our Anabaptist theological heritage, these quotes caused me a bit of discomfort. As I was researching for this sermon, I was intrigued that the Wikipedia, source of all sources, chapter on separation of church and state attributes the origins of the idea in part to the early Anabaptists in the 1500s. Here's a short section from Wikipedia. While there was a diversity of views in the early days of the Radical Reformation, Anabaptists came to teach that religion should never be compelled by state power, approaching the issue of church-state relations primarily from the position of protecting the church from the state. That's the end of the quote. The founders of the United States reflected the idea of separation of church and state in the First Amendment to our Constitution. Most of us have notions of what it says and may be able to recognize it, but probably could not quote it. Here is our First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The first part of the amendment gives two different aspects of the separation of church and state. First, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The state cannot establish religion. Or two, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The state can't prohibit free exercise of religion. Going back to the two quotes from the US Supreme Court decisions that I shared, a significant part of the disagreement between the majority and the dissenting opinions in those cases had to do with the tension between establishment of religion and free exercise of religion. The dissenting judges accused the majority of focusing on the free expression clause and ignoring the prohibition of establishment. That is where our Anabaptist theological heritage should inform us today. Rather than state the link myself, you might find it interesting that another court in 2005 case involving whether a Mennonite child could be required to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in public school, this judge succinctly summarized Anabaptist history in the following paragraph. The father of this child who was not wanting to say the pledge, the father belongs to the Anabaptist Mennonite faith, which condemns the mixture of church and state. Anabaptist Mennonites are a Christian sect that left Central Europe in the late 1600s because of religious persecution for belief in the separation of church and state. According to the Mennonite Confession of Faith, the primary allegiance of all Christians is to Christ's kingdom, not the state or society. Because their citizenship is in heaven, Christians are called to resist the idolatrous temptation to give to the state the devotion that is owed to God. That's the end of the cite quote from that judge. Indeed, Article 23 of the current Mennonite Church USA Confession of Faith in a Mennonite perspective reflects this primary allegiance of Christians to Christ's kingdom, not to the state. I have studied a number of early Mennonite confessions. Almost all cite Romans 13 and other passages for the idea that followers of Christ are to accept the authority of the state. And early versions of the Martyr's Mirror cited Matthew 22:21, the parallel to the Mark 12 passage that was in the scripture reading this morning. So both of these passages were cited by the early Anabaptists in discussing their understanding of the relationship between the church and the state. We as Anabaptists have a unique perspective to speak into this question. The very core and name Anabaptist reflects this. These early Christians believed that they should make a voluntary commitment to follow the way of Jesus. They believed that this required them to be baptized when they were mature enough to make a voluntary choice. But the state required that infants be baptized to make them citizens of the state when they also joined the church. At that time, the church and state were one, and being baptized as an infant did not signify anything about following Jesus. Being baptized as an infant signified joining the state and joining the church as one in the same. People joined the church. They did not demonstrate their commitment to follow Jesus. Church and state were one. This is precisely why these radical Anabaptists, or rebaptizers, who stopped baptizing infants and instead decided whether to be baptized when they could make a voluntary commitment, were hunted down, exiled, and killed. As Melissa Floor-Bixler, who led a study of her recent book here at Glennon Heights, wrote when she looked at Romans 13, quote, "We're Anabaptists, Mennonites who are descendants of an illegal breakaway from the Catholic Church. Early Anabaptists were hunted down, drowned, tortured, and burned for their anti-government action of baptizing one another upon confession of faith in Jesus Christ. This was a political act, one that defied the authorities of the day." Close quote. So what does this mean today in the United States in 2022 or in Glennon Heights Mennonite Church? The only thing that allowed the church and state to be one in the 16th century was that the church was in power and was a majority. Indeed, both the church and the state claimed and demanded allegiance from all its citizens. The very comfort that the alliance created was its danger. It caused the persecution of any dissenting minority. When a persecuted minority becomes the majority, it needs to remember its past. I believe that is what the Anabaptists would say to us today. Be wary of a closer and closer kinship of the church and the state. Be wary of any move to claim a nation for a particular religion. Be wary of the idea of Christian nationalism. Be wary, our Anabaptist sisters and brothers would say, because it feels good and it feels right when one is in the majority and is in power. But our witness, our Anabaptist sisters and brothers would say, is that followers of Jesus, even when organized as a church, need to be separate enough from the state to be able to witness to Jesus' way and call the state to a higher allegiance because of our primary allegiance to God. Our Anabaptist theological forebears could have enjoyed as much free exercise of religion as they wanted, as long as they accepted the church established by the state and accepted the church and state as one. In these times in which very little reduces our exercise of religion, may we not let that religious freedom lead us into thinking that the country in which we have that freedom does not also need the challenge of the church to a higher allegiance. The danger of a closer bond between church and state is a diffusion of that witness. On this, we need to hear our Anabaptist sisters and brothers. May we judge our own and our government's actions by reflecting Jesus' concern for the marginalized in society, even in times when we aren't so much on the margins ourselves.